Welcome to the podcast Stolen Science. My name is Dr. Daryl Racine, and we'll be looking at the contributions that Indigenous people made to Western science between 1670 and 1800. What we have to remember from the earlier podcast is that there were significant contributions by Indigenous people to Western European science during this early period. Why is that important? It's important because if we look at the history between Indigenous people in Canada and the U.S. for that matter, we'll be talking about the U.S. in a later podcast, but when we look at that relationship, it is depicted in history as if it was one way, that the non-Indigenous population just gave and gave and gave to Indigenous people in the context of philanthropy, and even in regards to residential school denial, that, oh, well, we taught them English and we taught them this, and they're not grateful. So we're trying to turn that around and say, no, Indigenous people made significant contributions to Western European society from a very early period. So what evidence do we have for the extraction of Indigenous knowledge from the Hudson's Bay area between 1670 and 1800? Now, you got to remember that in the early part of the Hudson's Bay Company, that the forts were only around Hudson's Bay. There were no inland forts. And those forts had a crew of Hudson's Bay Company traders as well as surgeons. So each major fort also had what was called a surgeon. Now, that terminology is a little bit problematic in the sense that a surgeon today, in the context of what they did, we would more consider it someone with advanced first aid. In other words, there wasn't that much in the context of surgery going on or any other in-depth medical treatment. So where we start is that in the years of 1736, 1737, and 1738, the Hudson's Bay Company Committee in London requested in their general instructions to the men at the forts to send, quote, roots, herbs, plants, and shrubs, and seeds, berries, and kernels, whilst the surgeon should identify them by their Indian names and list their quantities. And so very early in the 18th century, we start to see these collections come from the forts, and they are shipped back to the Hudson's Bay Company and the Royal Society. So the first person we'll look at is an individual by the name of Alexander Light. Alexander Light was a shipwright, and he brought home significant collections of a collection of zoological specimens, as well as some artifacts, but for the most part, zoological specimens. Now, these were gathered for an individual by the name of George Edwards, who a few years later would write a book, The Natural History of Uncommon Birds, which was published in 1750. Many of Light's collections are featured in Edwards' book. So we have one of the first comprehensive zoological books being produced in England in 1750 with a significant contribution from Hudson's Bay Company territory. Now, there isn't much evidence how Isham came about his information or came about his collection, but I think that we can agree that a significant portion would have had to be collected with the assistance of Indigenous people within the region. The second person we're looking at is a fellow by the name of James Isham. He was employed by the Hudson's Bay Company from 1732 until his death in 1761. In 1774, Isham sent a collection to London along with a manuscript. The manuscript contained First Nations vocabularies, descriptions of material culture, zoological descriptions, and general information on First Nations people who inhabit the Bay region. In reference to Isham's collection, Edwards reports, at his leisure times, his commendable curiosity led him to make collections of all the beasts, birds, and fishes of those countries, as well as the habits, toys, and utensils of Native America. Edward notes, with respect to Isham's zoological collection, that the furs of the beasts and the skins of the birds were stuffed and preserved very clean and perfect and brought to London in the year 1745. Edwards, in his indebtedness to Isham, is described in the final illustration of Part 3 of his work. And, quote, he says, the bird, and he's talking about what we know today as the ring-tailed hawk, was bought from Hudson's Bay by Mr. Isham, to whose curiosity and good nature I am beholden to the greatest part of the subject matter of this third part of the history of birds, and I believe the curious part of the world will not think themselves less obliged to Mr. Isham than I acknowledge myself to be. So these collections are being put together by Isham. I mean, and there is indication that even by the early point of Isham's collecting, that Indigenous people were starting to actually realize that these Hudson's Bay Company traders, on the bay, wanted different species of birds, and so they would bring them actually stuffed and presented them and used them as trade items to the Hudson's Bay Company traders. The next person we're going to look at is Andrew Graham. He was another company employee who became an effective agent of science. He became an agent of science during his apprenticeship under Isham. Graham began his career with the Hudson's Bay Company in 1749 and worked under Isham as a clerk from 1753 until Isham's death in 1761. Andrew Graham produced manuscripts and sent specimens back to the Hudson's Bay Company. These manuscripts and specimens used extensively in Pennett's Arctic Zoology of Walter Pennett's Arctic Zoology of 1785. Pennett states in his introduction to Arctic Zoology, quote, Mr. Andrew Graham, long a resident of Hudson's Bay, obliged me with a number of observations on the country and the use of multitudes of specimens of animals transmitted by him to the late Museum of the Royal Society. Now, what's important here, or what we have to remember, is that six of the 12 members of the Royal Society also sat on the Hudson's Bay Company Committee. And so it was very likely that those members of the Royal Society on the Hudson's Bay Company Committee were pushing for these scientific specimens. We know that Graham used Indigenous knowledge for the description and habits of natural history specimens. In regards to the sandhill crane, Graham states, we have found the manners of the species correspond so nigh to the whooping species that any further observations might lead us into error, which we have taken the greatest precaution to avoid by ascertaining our observations from the general voice of the natives. In other words, there's this idea, and it's starting to come about during Graham's time, that when you were looking for natural history information, that you would not interview just one Indigenous person, that you would actually interview many Indigenous persons on one particular species in order to confirm the information about that particular species of bird or beast or so on. One author notes that trading Indians who knew his interests were bringing him bird skins stuffed and dried from inland. And now when we say inland, we have to remember that the Hudson's Bay Company doesn't move inland until about 1785. So what was happening was many First Nations were traveling off the prairies. The Blackfoot, the Assiniboine, were coming all the way up to Hudson's Bay along the Churchill River to trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. And, so they get the request one year, and the next year they come, they arrive with stuffed birds and so on and so forth. And subsequently are probably interviewed and you get the best information for natural history publication. The next individual is Humphrey Martin. Humphrey Martin began his career with the Hudson's Bay Company in 1750 at the age of 21. He was initially employed as a writer but quickly rose in rank. He sent home to London a small collection of birds that first summer, 24 bird species a year later, and several hundred botanical and zoological specimens in 1774. There is evidence that Martin relied on Indigenous people for much of his information about the specimens. Martin states, and this is in Martin's words, I hope these gentlemen that inspect the aforewritten history of birds will observe that I do not absolutely declare all I have set down to be truth, except in what regards the swallow and the martin, as those birds I have a constant eyewitness. As to the others, the number of eggs, food, and the differences between male and female, I was obliged to have the best Indian intelligence I could get. I trusted not to the assertions of any single person, let his age or experience be what it would, therefore hope that I am near the truth, if not quite. So this idea that you extract information from several different indigenous people in order to get the most accurate information for natural history is extremely important, especially when we start talking about the publication of such information. This is significant. This is significant because up until this point, when we talk about the contribution of indigenous people to the Western European world, we talk about corn and squash, and there is no other, fundamental information about what indigenous contributions in fact were. So it's very important that we recognize that there was a significant contribution to Western European science at that time. The next individual we're going to talk about is a fellow named Thomas Hutchins. Thomas Hutchins, a surgeon from York Factory, began his career in the Hudson's Bay Company in 1766. Hutchins' interest in collecting these specimens probably started with the arrival of the company's instructions of 1771. Hutchins duly sent a large collection of specimens home in 1772 and 1773. There is no record of the actual specimens sent home by Hutchins from the Bay after 1773. However, he did produce several manuscripts indicating that he remained busy studying and procuring specimens. Hutchins, like Martins and Graham, also relied on First Nations people for behavioral information regarding each species. So by this time, you're starting to get the idea that as these employees came in and started to get employed, part of their job, it's almost part of their job, is to send back these scientific specimens. The other interesting piece is that they use common trading practices. So if you bring me this stuffed bird and tell me about that stuffed bird, then I can trade something for it. In other words, indigenous people were coming to trade for axes, for beads, for all sorts of other items. Well, this scientific information becomes a tradable product. Now, what's unfortunate about that is that indigenous people did not understand what the Europeans were doing with this information. The fact of the matter is that this information gets transferred to England, and then you have the publication of George Edwards' Uncommon Birds and Pennett's Arctic Zoology. You have the publishing of these works. Much of that information is indigenous knowledge, but indigenous people are very rarely acknowledged as being the progenitors of that information. And so what happens in history is, as we go down in history, is it gets lost. If indigenous people are going to be treated appropriately in the context of our history, then this kind of information needs to be put into text, and certainly indigenous youth need to consume this information. If I go over to the science building at my university and I search out for indigenous people, I'm going to find maybe 4 or 5 in our science building. Why is it that we do not have more indigenous people in the sciences? And my argument is that the reason we don't is because indigenous people do not feel that they are stakeholders, that they are the progenitors of a lot of this basic scientific information that was crucial for the advancement of Western European science. Now, in regards to Thomas Hutchinson, just carry on with him for a second. It would seem that collecting indigenous knowledge from First Nations people, and that the more First Nations people who were consulted, the more reliable the information. Hutchins tells us in regards to the red crossbill. Hutchins states, "The account I have now to give of this bird varies greatly from that sent from Mr. Graham last year. But when it is remembered that there are a great resort of natives to York Fort in comparison to those that go to Severn," those are 2 different Hudson's Bay Company forts, "it will be imagined with the justice that we are now nigher the truth, having more opportunities by gaining intelligence or information." So this means that this Hudson's Bay Company employee is arguing that because I talk to more Indians, my information is in fact better. This becomes a pattern, and a pattern of exploitation. Exploitation because indigenous people, even though they may be trading this information for beads or axes or a gun or whatever, they're not aware that these things are going back to England and it's being published. And those people that are publishing it get significant advantage. in Victoria's society where there's class. They will actually be able to go up classes, by providing this information, by becoming more important within their social milieu of Victorian society. I remember, and I'll be covering this a little later, but there was a Hudson's Bay Company collector by the name of George Barnston, and he goes to England. He sends collections to William Hooker at Kew Gardens, and when he goes to Kew Gardens, he is wined and dined. And the people sitting at that table are all top scientific people. Charles Darwin, William Hooker, and his son and his son Joseph, and many others. And so, the idea that Hudson's Bay Company employee, like he's just a clerk and maybe he's he's gone up in rank. When he left England, he was probably not part of the aristocracy. But when he goes back to England and he's providing all this stuff, all of a sudden, there is great benefit to him because he is actually with people of a much higher class within Victorian England. So, and this happens again and again. And in a later podcast, we'll talk about the United States. And the same thing happens in the United States with Hudson's Bay Company employees being invited to the Smithsonian. And they are wined and dined at the Smithsonian Institution with the top academics of the time. So there's a real benefit. There's also another added benefit to that, is that if you provided scientific information and objects or specimens, is that the upper echelon of the company would look favorable to that, and you would be more likely to be promoted because you are in fact providing this additional scientific information. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because if we look at the history of the Hudson's Bay Company, and I don't care, you go into the library, pick up any history of the Hudson's Bay Company, you can pick up any history. None of them will talk about the importance of science to the company. None of them. And none of them will talk about Indigenous contributions to that science. So it's as if the Hudson's Bay Company was just a company where you traded furs. And certainly my argument is no, they did not just trade in furs. They also traded in Indigenous knowledge. And that Indigenous knowledge becomes quite profitable. And this is certainly recognized by the scientific community in England. I mean, when we start talking, we'll talk a little later about Kew Gardens, that when they were gathering particular items and sending instructions out to the Hudson's Bay Company, is that they would bring in artifacts like, say, a bow or arrows or something like that. And certainly if you go to Kew Gardens today and you look at that particular item, they weren't interested that it was a Cree bow. They were interested in the type of wood or the type of resins that were used in making the arrows. In other words, that they were looking at it in the context of the manufacturing, the advantages in manufacturing or artistry. They were also interested in art, not to represent a particular Indigenous people, but to improve the artistic talents within the European milieu. And so it's unfortunate that by 1860 and 70, when we start the rise of ethnology and anthropology, that these items that were collected for their scientific worth or their technology in the context of resins or different types of woods or whatever, that it gets turned into, this is a Cree bow, this is a Cree arrow. In other words, they start to say, well, this represents this particular culture. But that's not why they were collected. That's not why those artifacts were collected. And so again, history is in fact erased. And so it's important that when we're looking at artifacts at the British Museum or Kew Gardens or the National Museums of Scotland, that we understand that in different periods of time that the collection motivations were significantly different. Because, as I said, by the time we get to 1860, everything starts getting cataloged within an anthropological context, and we lose all of that earlier information as to why those particular objects were collected. In the next podcast, I will be going on and finishing this particular section in regards to Hudson's Bay Company up to 1800. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing or supporting this podcast through the links in the description. Thank you very much.